I am very, very excited about our next speaker. He's coming in from Michigan today, joining us with a wealth of experience and knowledge on supply chain planning and execution. And I'm talking about the great Ron Crabtree, who is here with us. He's the CEO of Meta Ops and Meta Experts, a company he founded 20 years ago that focused on providing top-level talent to solve the most difficult business problems, including supply chain planning and execution problems. He's an organizational transformation architect and thought leader in operational excellence in supply chain and Lean Six Sigma best practices in a wide range of industry. He also serves as the executive advisor for the Next Level Purchasing Association. And Ron has a tremendous presentation for us today on the recent insights that he's been gathering from thought leaders and industry leaders related to supply chain. Ron, it's a real pleasure to have you with us. Thank you for taking the time to share your tremendous wisdom with our global audience today.
Thank you. All right then. All right, well, it's a real honor to be with you here today. And I've got to say, after more than 30 years as a practitioner, working mainly in the automotive industry and supply management, and in the last 20 years, working with a huge variety of organizations around what it takes to be successful. This last couple of years has been unprecedented. And Joe's Way did a nice job of kind of highlighting that. There's been a significant shift. Back in 2019, as we're working with the Next Level Purchasing Association folks, a big focus was supply chain efficiency, driving out cost and wringing out the last penny and total cost of ownership and really getting better and better at that. But we've had black swan, right, the last couple of years, and the shift is now moving toward more effective supply chains. And one of the things we try to do at Next Level Purchasing Association is make sure that what we're bringing out to our customers and sharing information to the world is cutting edge, it's on the leading edge. So we embarked on a mini survey a little earlier this year in January. So this is very much fresh off the press, where we got into talking with a number of very, very expert, people in the close-in network that we could get to spend some time with us that are, practicing chief purchasing officers and leaders in best practices in supply management. And we did a little mini survey and pulled that together. I'm going to be sharing the results of that here with you today, where we asked a couple of basic questions around what are the 3 biggest challenges going into 2022 and beyond, and then for their teams, right, for the supply management teams, what would be the most important skills that we need to get involved with? We're going to ask the audience to weigh in on your views related to both of these things as we get into it. And then we'll wrap up with a bit about NLPA and what have you at the end of the presentation. All right, so we conducted the survey with volunteers. These are senior supply management executives in a wide variety of industries. We had these 2 basic open-ended questions. You can see them here on the screen. And we captured little mini demographics, and so you can have a little feel for who participated in the survey and where these findings came from. So wide variety of industries. As you can see here, we had banking, we've got pharmaceutical, we have retail, mining, airline services, lots of interesting industries participated, and they came from around the world. The United States and North America being the biggest part, but good representation across Europe, the Asia Pacific Rim, Latin America, even into the Indian subcontinent. They're represented with thought leadership feeding into the results of our survey. So for the very first question, this was like, what are the top 3 things that kind of keep you awake at night? And you say are the biggest challenges we face in supply management going into 2022. And no big surprise, cost, price, inflationary issues are certainly very high in everybody's mind in terms of the things we need to be concerned about. But it didn't end there. Oh, hang on, back over there. It didn't end there. You'll notice like 23% around cost and inflationary issues. And then close follower, and you want to pay attention here, because when we get to question 2, which is what are the skills that we want people to master going forward, there wasn't a disconnect, but there was a shift. Right here, we're saying cost is really what we're worried about. But the second bullet here was very interesting around supplier risk management. development of suppliers, and management of suppliers. And then followed close behind that, logistics, logistical issues, cost of transportation, even getting sea containers has been a real nightmare if you've had the joy of trying to source from China into the United States. And after that, we talked about staffing. You know, that never came up 2 years ago. I never heard it. But, you know, with the great resignation going on here in the United States, you know, 4.5 million people changing jobs every month on average for the last several months, is like, yeah, things have really shifted. It's really hard to come up with people. The COVID pandemic, keeping people away from work, big hassle. After that, on-time delivery, lead time expansion, continuity of supply, sustainability of supply has been a big issue. And then technologies. And Josue mentioned that earlier. This is an important piece of the future. And you'll see that when we get down to what are the skills, they're not going to match up perfectly, which was very interesting and telling. Okay. The other thing I found very interesting is an increased awareness around extra organizational collaboration as being crucial going forward, all being important mentions. What we're going to do now is take a little bit deeper dive. So let's just take a look at this first category under cost specifics. And inside of that, there were 5 sub buckets, if you will, of how the survey responses came in. These 5 different things you can see here on your screen. I'd like to point out that the first 2 on this list, all 70% of all the responses we got from this community were pointing at inflation, rising prices, the mitigation of inflation, the unpredictability. In fact, 50% of all the comments under this category was specifically about that, with a close follower around logistics costs. I had reports of 5 times increase in the cost of a sea container, if you could even get one, to get that product moved to the United States from China. Really good observations around, okay, once supply chain issues start to go away, how can we tie the future prices to indices so that we can control that and get ahead of, you know, spiking costs, you know, 500% increase in costs for certain metals, and the volatility for commodities and material price volatility. So keep this in the back of your mind, because we're going to have a polling question coming up here in a few minutes. Pithy comments. I can let you read this on your own, but there was a lot of angst, shall we say, across this community of procurement, supply management professionals. And I really liked kind of here in a minute, the global disruptions cause supply side shortage. When you limit supply, your prices are going to increase. So limiting increases would be the forefront of the chief purchasing officer's duty, and there will be increases. So that was pretty interesting. Let's go to that next category of, I kind of coined this little term here for SRDMS, kind of take in supplier risk development and management strategies. And there's a big bucket of all these things kind of revolving around this whole thing. You know, there wasn't any big standout like we saw in the earlier one, but we had, you know, inventory, the risk assessment of suppliers, actually doing something about audit findings, right? Getting into your contracts to try to mitigate those supply issues. I had one CPO in particular to say, look, I can't find anybody to even take my bids. You know, I want to be able to go out and find more suppliers, diversify, and reduce my risk of interruptions. Our suppliers are saying, no, I mean, people say, we don't want more sales. We have all we can do right now. So that's really a challenge. And you can see some of these other things here that came into play around specifically supplier risk development and management strategies. This was the close number 2, right behind cost on the master list. Then we can continue with a couple of pithy comments here as well. You know, container shortages, port delays, driver shortages, really driving increased need for inventory. And then this whole notion of reshoring, nearshoring, or localization of supply, that was a common theme. And then lots of pain around what we've learned in the last couple of years about what we're going to do to try to mitigate supply issues in the future to minimize our enterprise risk. In addition to that, there was quite a bit of discussion around logistics. And as you see here, the identification of logistics, unlike never before, is now the weak link. And I've seen a lot of data lately out of logistics and 3PL communities suggesting that they were approaching 95% utilization of equipment for many, many months over the last couple of years. And that's like really? When, in the past, if you look back through history, anything approaching 80% utilization was considered a very, very healthy situation. But as it got north of 80%, it started straining and breaking the logistic chain across various carriers and purveyors of transportation. So we've stressed the capability of the logistical part of supply chain dramatically. And of course, that's been driving the cost up as well. And then we had kind of the rest, right? Staffing, people, resources, the shortage of skilled workers for us, right, in our own companies, but also within our suppliers. So what do we need to do to retain, and attract the talent we need to run the business, right? Capacity shortfalls at the supply side and also in our own companies. And then the on-time delivery and lead time expansion, assuring material availability, the extended lead times, particularly with stuff coming out of Asia and Europe toward the United States, and then trying to achieve on-time delivery at a fair price. And then we had continuity of supply. There were a lot of mentions around continuity and sustainability of supply. In fact, there will be a topic around that later this year as part of the NLPA webinar series. And then technology applied came up. Josue mentioned that early in this session, that stabilizing our systems and technologies, how do we really apply technologies for contract lifecycle management, vendor quality management, driving the use of artificial intelligence and digital transformation in the practice of supply management, very high in the minds of our purchasing community of chief purchasing officers. And then finally, this was really interesting that I've never really heard this much before, but we're certainly hearing it now more than before, is better communications, right? Between, some organizations, supply chain management as a function is actually not connected to purchasing and procurement. That's pretty common in the automotive industry. Well, there's recognition that we've got to come together and have much better collaboration between the planning, supply chain management side of it, inventory policies, all these other things that drive how we order and try to flow things through, along with increased acuity and knowledge around finance, right? Let's really take a longer view, right? More of a risk and longer view to how are we going to mitigate and manage our financial risk, enterprise financial risk, when it comes to the decisions that we make in our supply management strategies. So a very strong interest there as well. So that was quite a bit I ran through pretty quickly, but we're all smart people. But what we're going to do now is we're going to run a polling question. I want to ask Josue to fire that up here in a minute. But what I'd be interested in this little list is, this is the kind of the order that we talked about these, and then we're going to run a polling question now. And if you could pick, say, at least the top 3 in your mind that appear to be significant as priorities from a perspective of the challenges, the things we need to address in the coming year. Josue, if we could run that polling question now, please.
Coming through, launching right now. And which of these areas are in the top 3 priorities for your organization this year? Pick as many as you like, but not less than 3. So please select all that apply here, and go ahead and make your selection by choosing what are the main priorities for your business, for your organization, what is that you are experiencing. So go ahead and make those choices, and please vote. I have 10% of votes so far coming through. I'm going to give you a few seconds here to pick your top 3.
Yeah, and then if it's possible to actually show those to everybody at the end,
they are seeing, Ron. You are the only one who cannot see right now because you're the presenter, but everybody else, yeah.
Yeah, I'd be interested in the statistics, Josue, because this was kind of a top-down list we got from 2 different audiences. We the initial survey group, and then we had a bunch of NLPA folks who ran this by last couple of weeks ago, and we had pretty consistent, common thinking. But I'd be interested in statistically how this audience weighs in. What percentage we're thinking number 1 on this list, and so on, just to have a rough idea how this community that we're with today would view this challenge.
Outstanding. I think that most of everyone has voted. Very good participation. So what we got here is, I'm going to share the results with everyone so that you can see. And Ron, you may not be able to see this, so I'm going to read out loud for you.
Thank you.
We have at 83% Number one item was cost, price, and inflationary issues, and that has 83%. Then at 72%, supply and supplier risk management, development and maintenance at 72%. And then tied at third, we have the other two items, which is logistic, transport issues, and continuity of supply at 56%, on-time delivery and lead time expansion and technology at 56%, and finally, staffing at 22%.
Okay, awesome. So I find it pleasing and basically, you know, for an affirmation that what we were able to gather from our supply community of folks we started with in this work, still lining up pretty well. This is the second group we've been able to run these findings by, where you could give us some feedback. The thing I find interesting is that continuity of supply came up the food chain. The original work that we did, continuity was a little bit further down, but both of the audience have taken another crack at this with opinions that put continuity and sustainability supply closer to the top of the list. So that's a nice affirmation. All right, so let's take a breath, and we're not going to transition to this thing, right? What I'm interested in is if you could use the chat or the question tool, if we could just take a moment, and is there an area of priority for your organization that didn't come up here? Is there an area of priority for your organization that's really important? Could you share that using the chat tool? Probably. So it's wait, would be the chat tool or the question tool? Which would be better?
They would have to go into the questions box. So if you have any item that you'd like to add that is unique and is not on that list, go ahead and use the questions box to submit your entries, and we'll see on this side any entries that you submit.
All right, very good. So I'm gonna go over there and take a peek. And Josue, if you could share what people are putting in, that would be nice.
Yeah, I'll do it. I'll do it. Sometimes there's a little bit of a delay. Why don't you go ahead and keep going? And nothing's coming through so far, which I think your list is pretty comprehensive. There's Kate Stewart has raised supply chain security. Kate, thanks for that. That's a very, very important topic that we didn't cover explicitly.
Agree with that. In fact, cybersecurity comes up in the next questions. We get to the next, the last half of this survey. Cybersecurity and security of supply chain did come up. So that's a great observation.
So other than supply chain security, I think that you capture pretty well on that list.
All right, awesome. Well, in that case, we're going to move on. Take a deep breath, and now we're going to come to the second core question we had for this. This final question is, what are the top three capabilities your team needs to improve on going into 2022? And I found it very interesting that we had not really consistent with the first question. Things shifted. Remember, in the first question, it was about cost, really at the top of the list. But you know what? Cost doesn't even show up here until toward the bottom. So when it comes down to the skills, the chief purchasing officers, our community that we tapped into, they felt like, you know what, we've got to manage this supply strategy. We've got to get in front of this risk thing. We've got to manage the change. 47% of everything that was mentioned around skill development was specifically around that, followed by supplier development and supplier management, and followed by technology. So that came up the list quite a bit, followed by sales, inventory, and operations planning, the management, logistics, management skills, cost management, and finance acumen, and finally, you know, supplier quality. And I have heard reports that supplier quality has gone down in the last couple of years as we put so much pressure on the supply chain. So it wasn't surprising to me to hear that one come up. So let's take a look now at the nitty gritty, right? So let's get in that very first category. And I found this pretty fascinating. There were 11 different things that kind of came under this bucket of supply strategy, risk, and change management. But if you notice, the first three things on this list were 50% of everything out of these 11 basic categories that people were responding to kind of slotted these things in. Flexible strategy and real-time decision-making. Improved skills to do that to manage both demand and supply. Pragmatic risk assessment. And then the mitigation actions to make sure suppliers are capable
modeling risk, and then finally, how do we manage complexity? How do we find efficiencies, not cost, efficiencies? So let's talk about efficiencies for a second. We're not talking about just the price. We're talking about total cost of ownership as a way of thinking about that. But efficiencies could be just the fact that I can get it at all allows my internal manufacturing operations to run like they should, and we can make our sales numbers and get stuff out the door, even though the price is not what we want. We're going to gain system efficiencies in terms of our performance as an organization, end to end, maintain or even grow our market share if our competition is not being successful at dealing with these problems. So that number 3 there is a very, very insightful thing that came out of this. Of course, executive management skills, we're basically empowering our leaders to be more effective in all of this. And then number 6 on that list, to focus on sustainability. So social responsibility hasn't gone away. They certainly have had to take a bit of a back seat the last couple of years in the quest of just getting the stuff in. But it's still there and it's not going away. And then these other things here you can read on your own. So I found that pretty interesting. And I'll mention this here a little bit later as we get into wrap up. Category number 2, this is specifically around supplier development and supplier management skills. And we had these 8 different things that kind of came out of it. But interestingly enough, these top 2, 50% of all the responses specifically revolved around these 2 things, negotiation skills. But you notice here, pricing wasn't the big thing here. Is number 1, surety of supply, right? On-time delivery, pricing, and then quality, and so on and so forth. So that was a big hitter with respect to, we've got to lift our skill sets around those areas in particular. And then, no surprise, we got to identify new suppliers. We have to get very creative about developing and acquiring different ways to feed materials, information, the things we need in our supply chain to execute. We have to be better at that, being able to manage that, dual sourcing, better partnering skills, and supplier relationship. SRM means supplier relationship management skills. And then basically, wait a minute, what about supplier alliances? Should we be doing that? And then what can we do to mitigate or work with our suppliers to reduce the pain associated with the labor shortages in the trucking industry? And, all the cost and performance issues that fall out of that. So there's very good insights here around what they need in terms of these kinds of skills. Then we get into the rest of it, right? So we had technology, right? We had like 10% of everything wrapped around, IT systems implementation, upgrading skills overall, much learning about how artificial intelligence can come into play, how automation and digital transformation can actually work. And surprise, surprise, we got to get back to using our ERP systems properly. And yeah, Excel isn't going to go away. So we better be skilling up our folks to have better analytical skills to work through things. And then here's the mention here around cybersecurity. This would be supply chain security. And there's a couple of pieces to this. There's the disruptive side, right? The bad guys, actually causing problems in supply. But then more importantly, how we're going to work with suppliers to design into their products or services we provide to make it proof, right? Our ability to fight off the cybersecurity issues and actually building that into our future products and services. We need to have skills to really understand what that's about as procurement supply professionals, getting upstream into our suppliers and assuring that they're thinking about these things, that they're helping us figure out the best ways to assure the secure supply chain, not only for just getting us the stuff, but also all the hacking and ransomware and all the other horror stories we hear about when people are hacking into the systems. And every single machine and piece of equipment nowadays needs to be interfaced. We think about digital transformation and interoperability of equipment. Well, there's all kinds of holes, gaping holes, where we have really old technologies and controls. And if that gets connected to the internet, and that gets without the right kind of firewall, you just opened up the back door for the bad guys to come in through your machines into your network and wreak havoc at your company. So this is a big deal in end-to-end supply chain management. Then we had inventory and operations planning management, forecasting skills, being able to cope with the whipsaw of unpredictable and variable demands. I mean, in the automotive industry, which I know well, being in Michigan, chip shortages. I won't go into the story about why all that happens, but That has driven all kinds of malaise across the automotive industry, and then certain kinds of commodities also being scarce. And that's caused really weird things to happen to the supply chain. For example, it's Friday, we're scrambling to get our last orders ready to go, and they call us at 4:59 p.m. on a Friday and say, oh, by the way, we're shutting down our assembly plant next week. Don't ship. Yeah, so that kind of stuff's going on as well. And then, SIOP means sales, inventory, and operations planning, if you're not familiar with the jargon. And what are those best practices? And what are some of the options we have to improve our capabilities from an inventory management perspective? To have inventory at the right places in the supply chain at the right level of completion so that we can actually be flexible and nimble to respond to changes in the demand pattern, be able to repurpose different materials for different customers on the fly would be all pieces of that in terms of the strategy. And then we had logistics and all these other things here, right? The management of logistics is a skill set, a very specific skill set. You can't necessarily always outsource it. It is a skill set we need to get better at within the procurement organizations. Cost development skills. There's some pretty powerful stuff out there now in the marketplace available around modeling and determining what you really should be paying for things, and really getting good at understanding the correct indices to tie pricing to and things like that. I've heard a lot about finance acumen that I hadn't been hearing a couple of years ago. So the stronger finance acumen to be able to collaborate with the finance group around longer term enterprise risk trade-off decisions around supply, because in the past it was always about supply chain efficiency, drive down the cost, less inventory just in time, versus supply chain effectiveness. And I think there's an awakening here around we're paying the price in some cases, a very large enterprise cost associated with becoming too efficient versus effective in supply chains. And then quality came up, surprise, surprise, as a skill set that we need to get better at as well. All right, so that brings us to polling question number 2. And again, just as we did in polling question number 1, I'm very interested in what this audience would say from your perspective. What do you think are the most critical buckets for training? If we can go ahead and run that polling question now, and I'd be interested in the statistics on that.
Very good, Ron. Just to give you a time check here, we're 5 minutes away from the Q&A portion. So I will run the poll as quickly as I can over here. So here it's coming. Which of these are top 3 priorities for your organization this year? Is that the right one, or it's a different one?
For skills development right here. Yep, for skills development this year.
For skills development this year?
Yep.
All right, so the poll is not saying that explicitly. So for the audience, focus on skills development specific. Which one of these areas are most important to you for skills development? Is it cost, price, inflationary issues, supplier,
sounds like
supply risk management and development and maintenance, logistics, staffing, or on-time delivery and lead time?
Yeah, that's a shame. Apparently the polling question didn't get set up correctly.
Yeah, the second one has pretty much the same wording. I think that Brian needs to combine them. So I'm just gonna move on from this.
Sure.
Ron, if you don't mind, you only have 4 minutes before we wrap up, so let's make the best use of your time here. So I'm gonna close and not share this one. Just if you can keep going.
All right, very good. So get this. Get my camera out of the way here so I can see this live myself. Just give me another split second. Here we go. So we're not going to do this one because we didn't even get a chance to do the poll, right? What were the other supply management skills priorities for your organization? So we're going to pass by that, and we'll get into the Q&A here in a moment. So if you've never heard of the Next Level Purchasing Association, they're the world's largest community of members, nearly 200,000 people in 160 countries around the world. And they offer online, on-demand certification programs in supply management. These two here, the CPOM, CPOE being new, been working with them over the last couple of years to get those programs perfected and brought to market. They're all about empowering people to move forward, to master the most important challenges. And then finally, this learn it, do it model. And I've got Adam's information here if you want to learn more about that, but it's outcome-based ROI-based training where you're picking specific objectives, organizational objectives, like getting a lot better at supply risk management, for example, and having live training, right, and actually doing activities to drive toward outcomes within the business. And then my company, just briefly about us, I mentioned that earlier, we're all about providing thought leadership and people to fill the gaps to make things happen. I'll let you scan that for a few seconds, just kinds of roles that we get involved with to help our customers and our partners get the skills and the abilities they need to move the needle quickly. And then, just without belaboring it, there's the levels of talent, from architect grade to expert that can plug in to get things done within organizations at any level, be it jumping into purchasing to help chase the parts down, to leading this major initiative to rethink how we manage our supplier development and risk management strategy going forward at the architect level. And just give you a flavor for that. Come out and visit us at the website to learn more about it if you like. So with that, I think we can move into Q&A now. What we've covered here is a bit of the demographics, shared the data, what we learned, and we got some feedback from the audience around the big challenges and what are the most important skills, and a bit about us. So with that, I think we can move into Q&A.
That's outstanding, Ron. Thank you for sharing that. That those insights from what is a very recent survey and on the topic of supply chain. So a number of different questions here, and I encourage you guys to continue to ask these questions. I have another monitor here that captures all the questions that you're bringing in. I'm gonna get to as many of them as we have time for. So continue to post your questions, and I'll relay them to Ron in real time here. So the first question has to do with the specific technologies. You talked about the transformation that's happening on supply chains for greater effectiveness, not so much efficiency, but effectiveness, which is an interesting shift. And then you mentioned a few technologies, and Mohan Srinivasan asked about blockchain. And this is a very good question, I think, because there is the hype and there is the reality of blockchain. So from a practitioner standpoint, what are you seeing, Ron, out there in the marketplace right now? That's not just the concept of blockchain, and maybe it's worthwhile to talk a little bit about what that concept could be. But then the follow-up question is, are people using blockchain in their supply chains? Are you seeing that being deployed, or is still largely a technological concept that hasn't been implemented yet?
Well, you're saying a lot. When you talk about digital transformation, blockchain is just a piece of that, right? So it's by far not the major piece of what digital transformation is all about. A couple of years ago, we developed some awareness training for one of our big customers, e-learning company, around digital transformation. There were 26 different forms of digital transformation, just one of those. And we mapped that against supply chain as part of what we did. So blockchain it depends on the industry you're in. It depends on the quality of the data and the information and the willingness of the supply partners to participate in that immutable ledger of what the transactional information is as something moves through its life cycle, right, from the original supply point to the consumption of it. And there's been adoption. It's not as broad as you might expect. I don't know what the statistic is on that, but you're going to find it depends a lot on the industry and the nature of the risk that's associated. When you get into counterfeiting, risk of counterfeiting, the risk of just, misstating what's being shipped, those are pretty obvious things you have to go after. But I'm going to say that our maturity level and the adoption of blockchain, the way it's theoretically possible to really fully utilize it, can't be more than 25% of maturity.
Are there any, when you mentioned certain industries that are implementing blockchain at a larger scale, what industry segments come to mind?
Well, the automotive sector has been a leader in many respects with, zapping technologies. They've had the ability to communicate seamlessly with suppliers in terms of, planning and then shipping authorizations, even sequencing, having stuff delivered into assembly plants from the supplier an hour away and only having, a couple hours worth of inventory in the entire system. They've been mastering that. Well, now they begin pushing that upstream into how we really want to master knowing where stuff is. And that's been a huge headache, because even though we have blockchain, If that container's on a ship out in the port and it's buried in there somewhere, what's blockchain doing for it, right? So it's not solving all of our problems. It's not a panacea. It's a piece of the puzzle.
Very, very good, Ron. Very good. Following up on that, since let's stay on the automotive industry a little bit as a great example of the supply chain disruptions that organizations are dealing with. So there are lots of questions related to semiconductor shortages and affecting the automotive industry. So what do you see as a practitioner on those types of shortages, and you know, what can planning do when you have a shortage of that magnitude hit your supply chain? Because and the preamble to that is that supply chains have been focusing for quite some time on becoming very efficient, and they became very efficient, and then, you know, just in time and wonderful things are going on until you have a disruption like that, and then people start saying, you know, our just-in-time systems are not working because of this disruption now. So talk a little bit about this trade-offs between efficiency and effectiveness, but it's, and some commentary maybe about what's going on with semiconductor shortages.
Yeah, that's a great point. I think there's a couple of aspects that are important. One is, you know, the way we always did business came back to bite us, right? So without, you know, vilifying anybody, there was no careful thought about, you know, if we just turn off all of our orders for chips, stop, because, you know, we're not going to be building cars, without stopping to think about what's the risk to this organization once we come back up of actually having chips. So this whole notion of really thinking carefully about how do we protect the enterprise risk, you know, there's certain parts of the automotive industry that don't have chip shortages. Why? They kept their orders in place, right? They recognized that was a significant risk. There's other automotive, you know, OEMs that are struggling to this day, right, dealing with that. So there's an important lesson learned there around really understanding what are the sources of supply risk that are longer term, or what do we do to mitigate that in terms of our policies and our procedures when things happen. The second piece is around, you know, thinking about development of nearshore and reshoring of the capability and inventory. There's a huge initiative out there, and I'm sure somebody will talk about it during the conference, where the government has been working on managing supply chain risk for the country, right? The United States, for example. And there's been a lot of discussion about the effective versus the efficient supply chain. You'll find very quickly that when it comes to defense, the aerospace industry and government and defense, they're way out front when it comes to making sure that we're mitigating and preventing serious disruptions of supply that will affect our ability to defend our country and to feed our people. There's some leadership there. The third piece there is, what can we do to accelerate standing up capacity in the United States or nearshore, so that we're not totally dependent on Chinese sources, for example. So there's a big move to very quickly put in new chip manufacturing facilities. The problem is it takes 2 years to stand up a new chip manufacturing facility. Once you decide you're going to do it, actually beginning to making chips, it's almost a 2-year cycle. So we're going to see here in the next, I'm going to say next 2 or 3 months, some of that capacity should start coming online. And I'm guessing by the end of 2022, the chip shortage will be a fond memory, I'm hoping, for the automotive industry in particular.
Yeah, those are very important perspectives. On that note, for the audience, on day 3, we're gonna have Rosemary Coates talking to us about this topic of reshoring. She is actually the founder and executive director and chairman of the board of the Reshoring Institute in the United States, and so she's going to be going deep into this specific item. Just your perspective, curious, Ron, because you work across so many different industries. Reshoring takes some time to you know, to make it happen. What is the pace that you see on that? Is it people talking about reshoring? People are actually doing the reshoring at this point? What are you observing across industries right now?
Well, both. There's a lot of people talking about reshoring, and there's a lot of action to do the reshoring. So you heard the term maquiladores, which would be different parts of Mexico that specialize in supporting different kinds of industries. You know, that's been with us for a long time. But there's a development of, capabilities within Mexico where there's facilities that have been stood up for reshoring purposes, where they have the factory space, they've got the labor, they've got all the legal stuff handled. All you need to do is bring your equipment and the know-how, and they handle everything else for you. And that's like kind of a kiosk thing that can literally be done in 30 to 90 days, right? And that's a huge undertaking, but something that organizations are really carefully looking at. And there's been definitely a move to, what can we bring back in-house to make ourselves again, that we've made a decision to move offshore. And I find an interesting dichotomy there, which are, even within the automotive industry, I've talked to executives that are like, we're getting out of China, right? And I've talked to executives that say, we're going to get bigger in China. And the latter is because they figured out how to work with the Chinese within the constraints of what they're all about, and coming up with the right level of partnership and, basically a mutual benefit. They're actually increasing their stake in China, surprisingly enough. So you definitely have a polarization there. But I think by and large, there's definitely a heavier swing toward the effectiveness side of supply chain and the reshoring or the nearshoring of crucial componentry that we can't produce without.
Very good. Lots of comments and questions here. Really, first of all, thank you for the fantastic presentation. Karen Kirby mentions that. Mohan Srinivazan appreciates your answer related to blockchain as well. We have time for one more question here before we wrap up this session and set up the next ones. And my question is a bit future looking. What do you see the rest of 2022 shaping up to be, and maybe special of the focus area for supply chain planning and development for the rest of 2022? Where do you see the main focus of the industry when it comes to supply chain?
It's going to be a little bit dependent on the industry itself, right? And the degree of exposure they have to, I'll call it, sourcing from overseas to support their ability to perform. So it's really going to be industry specific in terms of what they're going to favor for one strategy versus another. I think, generally speaking, you're going to be looking at what are we going to do to get control of our costs, right? And this comes back to better negotiation skills, developing better suppliers that have the ability to partner with us and help us share the risk, if you will, and begin to mitigate that and move it in the right direction. There's a ton of effort underway of taking a really hard look at what can be done in Mexico versus overseas here in the United States. I think that, certain industries like the automotive industry, there's not going to be a huge change in terms of what their sourcing is, chips aside, right? Maybe a few other things that are crucial. Other industries, you're going to see a lot, is pulling it back toward, the home country. That's going to be a big push because it's just been too painful, right? With respect to couldn't even ship to customers, being put on allocations. That was, in the furniture industry of all things, RV industry is going crazy, right? Well, look out. Everybody's on foam allocations. What? And you can't even make seats and couches and get them into those RVs to get them out the door in time. For customers, you're having to go. This is not just automotive. I mean, it's pretty interesting. It's related vehicles, but I found that to be a kind of a fascinating. How could it get into allocations on foam? But you have feedstocks of chemicals. Some of those chemicals come from overseas, and it's a ripple effect. So it's a much bigger question than we can answer here at this time.
That's for sure, Ron. Thank you so much. What is the best way? I know you and your team of experts are working across all industries in the United States and abroad, accelerating supply chains, improving supply chains. What is the best way for the audience to get to know what you're up to and maybe contact you directly when they need some support?
Well, I'm all over on LinkedIn, so you can learn about me there, Ron Crabtree. And if you Google Ron Crabtree and supply chain or Lean Six Sigma, you get a million hits. rcrabtree@medops.com. If you want to email me, that's great. And metaexperts.com would be our main company website, where you can come in just to learn more about what we're up to. There's quite a bit going on there in terms of information about what's going on, and then of course continue to be very involved with thought leadership. So if you're looking for sources of information, like where can I go to get more information about procurement, for example, I can connect you with NLPA and other organizations or if there's digital transformations on your mind, who can talk to me about the best, cloud-based asynchronous planning across the entire supply chain so we can optimize the flow of inventory. There are people that can help with that, so I'm happy to share.
Very good. Ron, so I have a request for you. Please go onto the LinkedIn post that I have under my name on LinkedIn and put a comment in there, because I didn't have you on the original listing for this conference, and I want to make sure that people have a way of connecting directly with you. So make a comment in there. Great presenting to you this morning. This is going to be an easy way for the audience to go in there and then see your name and click on it, connect with him on LinkedIn, find out more about what's going on. I want to thank you on behalf of our global audience today for taking the time to share your tremendous wisdom and expertise with all of us.
Awesome. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. That's Ron Crabtree, CEO of Meta Experts, with us, sharing his wisdom about supply chain. And there is a whole lot more to come. We have 3 outstanding presentations still today. Lots of questions about, am I going to have access to these presentations? Yes, you will. These presentations are being recorded, and for several of you who will be watching them on demand, a link and password will be sent to you next week or 2 after the conference is completed. Now, what's coming up today still? We are going to be heading to California next, where we're going to have a world expert on supply chain sharing his expertise with us, specifically about how to achieve supply chain control through end-to-end visibility. And I'm talking about Jim DeVries, the management partner of Enhance International Group. After that, we're going to shift into supply chain disruptive technologies. And we're going to have a global technology leader and the senior director for UiPath with us. And Shibaji Das is going to talk to us about how automation brings value to supply chain management today. He's going to be talking about the latest in terms of intelligent automation being applied to supply chains. And then we're going to wrap up today with me, where I am going to cover with you over the benchmark of more than 1,000 great enduring organizations of our time. What do they look like when it comes to digital transformation? But we're going to get to the point that there is no digital transformation without business transformation, without cultural transformation. And my session will be focused on supply chain and transformation. There has been a tremendous acceleration on cultural, business, and digital transformations across all industries. So I'm going to share with you the latest of the best organizations on how they are doing it right and what it looks like. So I hope to see you in these next 3 sessions. We're going to wrap up now. So I finish this session and I reopen at the top of the hour. So take a break now. I will launch it back at the top of the hour with Jim DeVries and end-to-end supply chain control.